Hi, welcome back. Our previous lesson was on public goods and the free rider problem. Today we are going to be looking at supply and demand in the labor market. So the labor market, like other markets, is subject to forces of supply and demand for labor services. Now, in this lesson, we are going to learn how supply and demand work in the labor market. Let's first look at labor supply. So labor supply represents the quantity of labor that individuals are willing and able to offer at different wage rates. So now you see that in the labor market, the supply side is from the individual. So just like in the goods market, individuals demand goods and then firms supply the goods. In the labor market, it's the other way around. Individuals, they supply labor and then firms demand the labor. So when we define labor supply, it's just representing the quantity of labor that an individual, or if you are looking at the aggregate level, all individuals are willing and able to offer at different wage rates. Now let's look at a simple example in the case of a restaurant and consider an individual called Billy. So when the wage was 5 per hour, Billy decided to supply 8 hours. And then when the wage increased to 6, Billy increased his labor supply to 10. And when the wage increased to 7, Billy decided to increase the labor supply to 12. Now let's represent this on the curve just like we did for the goods market. Now when we are drawing this curve, we have wages on the vertical axis and the quantity of labor supplied on the horizontal axis. Our first wage rate, which is 5. So when wage was 5, Billy's labor supply is 8. And when we are looking for a labor supply, labor demand, we usually look at it in terms of hours that is supplied or demanded. So in this case, we can just say that when wage rate is 5, Billy supplies 8 hours of labor. So this is represented by point A on this curve. And then when wage increased to 6, Billy decided to increase the labor supplied to 10. So this is represented by point B on this labor supply curve. And then when wage increased to 7, Billy decided to increase the labor supply. And this is represented by point C on this labor supply curve. So if we join point A, B, and C, this gives us what we call the labor supply curve. And in this example, this is for Billy. So this is how you draw your labor supply curve using any information that you have. Now we can see that there are several things to note on this labor supply curve. So the first thing is that we notice that it is upward sloping. What this means is it has a positive slope. Now, this is a typical case for a labor supply curve, but then we have extreme cases where it's not upward sloping. We'll look at it in our other lessons. So, upward sloping labor supply curve, it simply means that as wages increase, individuals are willing to supply more labor because the opportunity cost of not working becomes higher. So we will talk about what we mean by opportunity cost of not working. So just before we do that, you can see that if as wages increase, labor supply also increase. So this is what we call an upward sloping curve. Now, why is this the case? So there are two things to note here. The first is the opportunity cost of not working is the wage that you forgo. So you have maybe 24 hours to either work or not work. So if you are working, then you are not doing something else that you could have been doing with that same time. But then if you are not working, then it means that you are foregoing a certain wage every hour that you're not working. So for instance, if you have working and not working, if you work, you earn a wage rate. So if you are not working, then you are not earning this wage. So the opportunity cost of not working is the wage that you forgo. So in this case, if the wage is high, then the opportunity cost of not working is also high. If the wage is low, then opportunity cost of not working is low. So this is one reason why we typically have an upward sloping labor supply curve, because anytime the wages increase, the opportunity cost of not working is the wage that you forgo, and this opportunity cost increases. So this incentivizes people to give up more time to work, and this means that higher wages, you're going to work more. Now, the other thing that account for the upward sloping curve is that the benefit of working increases as your wages increase. As long as the benefit you're getting from something is increasing, then you are more likely to keep doing that thing. So when wages are increasing, the benefit that you get from working, which is the wage rate, is also increasing. Hence, workers will forgo other opportunities and increase their labor supply at the restaurant as the wages rise. So these two things, they account for the upward sloping labor supply curve, which is simply the law of supply in general, that the higher the price of a good, the higher the supply of that good. Now, as I said, this is a typical case that we see in most instances, but there are other cases where the labor supply is not upward sloping, and we will look at this in other lessons. Now that we've talked about labor supply, let's move on to the labor demand curve. So the labor demand curve, it represents the quantity of labor that employers are willing to hire at different wage rates. So as I said, in the labor market, employers now demand and individuals now supply. So at every wage rate, the quantity of labor that employers are willing to hire is the labor demand. So in the case of this restaurant, if this is the same wage rate that we looked at, now let's look at the demand side. Assuming when the wage is 5, demand is 12 hours. Now we can see this on the graph. When wage is 5, demand is 12 hours and is represented by point A. When wage increases to 6, demand decreases to 10 hours, which is at point B. Now, when wage increases to 7, demand decreases to 8 hours, which is at point C. So if we join these 3 points now, we have the labor demand curve. Now you can see that this is opposite of the labor supply curve because it is downward sloping. Now this simply means that as wages increase, employers may be less willing to hire additional workers due to higher labor cost. So it's like just like the law of demand. When the cost of something increase, you demand less of it. So in this case, higher wages means that employing an additional person becomes more costly. So employers will be less willing to hire labor. If they have other substitutes, like maybe capital, they might think of switching to capital instead of labor as the wages increase. So the downward sloping labor demand curve is, as I said, simply like the law of demand, which is applied to the labor market. So what we've learned here today is the labor supply curve is upward sloping, the labor demand curve is downward sloping. Now, let's look at these two graphs and see at that point of equilibrium where they intersect, what happens to wages and quantity. We remember from our previous lessons that at a point in the goods market, at a point where demand and supply intersect is where we determine our equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So we can use that same analogy to now evaluate how wages are determined in the labor market. So this is our labor supply curve. This is our labor demand curve. This is our wage and then our quantity supplied or demanded. So you can see that the labor demand curve is downward sloping, the labor supply curve is upward sloping. So at this point E, where the two curves intersect or are equal, is our equilibrium point. So that is how how wages are determined in the labor market. So wages are determined by the intersection of the downward sloping labor demand curve and the upward sloping labor supply curve. In this example, this is point 6. Now, this equilibrium point, what it implies is that at this point, the exact number of hours that individuals are willing to supply is the exact number of hours that firms are willing to hire. So there's no surplus in the market, there's no shortage in the market. So, and that is our equilibrium point. So this is how wages are determined in the market, looking at the intersection between the labor supply curve and the labor demand curve. So this is all that we have on our lesson on supply and demand in the labor market. Our next lesson will be on labor demand, which is determining how employers decide how many people to hire. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.